Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the break room when they thought she wasn't listening. Just a night shift shadow who kept her head down and her mouth shut during rounds. Brooke Sullivan had heard the dismissals 1,000 times over 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. The way Dr. Ashford's eyes slid past her in the hallway like she was part of the furniture. The way residents asked the respiratory therapist questions instead of the nurse who'd already checked the vent settings. Just competent enough to be useful. Just invisible enough to be forgotten. They had no idea what hand steady those were. They had no idea what muscle memory lived in those forearms. The overnight shift at Oak Creek Memorial smells like antiseptic and the thin, metallic fear that comes at 3 in the morning. Fluorescent lights hum their constant mechanical prayer over the ICU beds. Each one holds someone's worst night. Brooke moves through the unit with the efficiency of someone who has memorized every corner, every alarm, every rhythm. Her badge hangs from a beaded lanyard, her scrubs are faded blue from 100 washings, and her dark hair is pulled back so tight it pulls the skin smooth at her temples. She doesn't wear makeup. She doesn't wear jewelry except for a single wedding ring on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her scrubs where no one can see it. Tonight is a Tuesday. Slow. Stable patients in beds 2, 4, and 6. Bed 3 is empty. The monitors beep their steady rhythms like distant metronomes. Brooke checks labs on the tablet. Recounts medications in the Pyxis machine. Does the work that holds people alive in their sleep. It's nearly 4 in the morning when the radio crackles. The sound cuts through the hum like a blade. Incoming trauma. ETA 8 minutes. Male, 28, GSW to the abdomen and thoracic cavity. Pressure 80/52. Hemorrhage controlled en route but unstable. Alert your ONEG and prepare for massive transfusion protocol. Brooke's hands don't move. Her face doesn't change. But something shifts behind her eyes. The professional part of her, the part trained to manage crisis, is already 2 steps ahead. The other part of her, the part that lives in the darker years, goes very still. What blood type? She asks the charge nurse, Patricia, who's standing at the desk with a phone still pressed to her ear. Patricia covers the mouthpiece. They said ONEG. We have 4 units. They're requesting any available matches in-house for rapid replenishment. Says the patient's a Navy SEAL, security detail en route, this is a classified transport. Brooke nods. O negative. Universal donor. Common enough. Except Patricia is already pulling up the blood bank inventory on the main computer, and her expression is shifting from administrative focus to something closer to concern. We're going to be short, Patricia says quietly. With a GSW to the thoracic and abdomen, we're looking at 4, maybe 5 units just for the initial transfusion. If he makes it to the OR, they'll need more. She looks at Brooke. Can you donate? We're clearing bed 3 for him now. The question is routine. Brooke is O negative, which means every hospital in Houston has her on a permanent list. It's why they hired her, if she's honest with herself. Good nurse. Better donor. The skill set is useful. Yes, Brooke says. It comes out flat. Professional. The voice of someone who has made harder decisions in worse light. 8 minutes becomes 6 becomes 2. The ER doors slam open and the world becomes controlled chaos. There's a stretcher with a body on it, pale, muscled, his uniform soaked dark with blood that's already started to brown at the edges. Military personnel in matching black gear follow like a shadow. One of them has a hand on the patient's tactical vest. Another speaks into a radio in language that's professional and clipped. Medical personnel swarm. Doctors. Nurses. Trauma surgeons who move like they've done this 1,000 times. Dr. Ashford arrives from the physician's lounge, his white coat already buttoned, his face arranged into the expression of controlled authority he wears like armor. He's tall. Silver at the temples. The kind of doctor who looks like he's been chosen for the role by God himself. The patients love him. The nurses fear him. The residents scramble for his attention during rounds. "What do we have?" His voice is the sound of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. 28-year-old male, Navy SEAL, GSW thoracic and abdominal. The trauma surgeon responds without looking up from the patient. Estimated 2 liters blood loss. Pressures holding at 84/58. We have 1 for wide open, second line going in now. The stretcher moves toward the operating room. The controlled chaos becomes organized momentum. Ashford moves with them, asking rapid-fire questions. The military personnel stay close. One of them speaks into his radio, and Brooke catches fragments, coordinates, status, authorization level. "We need blood products," Patricia says to Brooke. "Now. Get to room 23. They're setting you up for direct transfusion." Brooke doesn't hesitate. She's already moving. The preparation takes 5 minutes. And 4 in her arm, a needle into the crook of her elbow, the tubing connected to a collection bag. She's done this before. Her veins are good. Her donation comes fast, steady, without the lightheadedness some people report. She watches the bag fill with her own blood, watching it change color from crimson to the darker shade of what's already beginning to oxidize. It doesn't feel like sacrifice. It feels like obligation. Like something her hands know how to do without asking permission from her brain. 20 minutes later, that blood is going into a 28-year-old SEAL whose body is trying very hard to survive what someone did to it. Brooke is back on her feet, a little lighter, a little lower in iron, moving back to the unit to finish her shift while the team works on keeping him alive. The OR holds him for 4 hours. When he emerges, he's on a ventilator. Sedated. Connected to machines that breathe for him and monitor the fragile electrical rhythms of his heart. They place him in bed 3. The bed that was empty this morning. Brooke helps move him from the stretcher. She works the mechanical lift, steadies the tubing, checks the lines. She's done this hundreds of times. The routine is so familiar it could happen in sleep. But as they settle him into the bed, one of the military personnel places a tactical vest on a chair beside him. Canvas. Worn. Bullet holes stitched with careful precision into the fabric. And dangling from the corner of the vest, on a chain that's broken in the middle, is a single dog tag. Brooke's hand still for exactly 1/4 second. No one sees it. No one would notice. But she sees it. The way the metal catches the fluorescent light. The way it hangs there like a question mark. Like a ghost made physical. Her fingers reach out without instruction from her conscious mind. She lifts the dog tag. The metal is warm from being worn against skin, warm from whatever this man has survived. The edges are worn smooth from handling. She can feel the indent of the name stamped into it, and she doesn't have to read it to know what it says, because names don't matter anymore. What matters is the broken chain. What matters is that someone is still alive and wearing it. She replaces the tag, lets it fall back against the vest, and turns away. That's when she feels it. The weight of eyes on her. Dr. Ashford is standing in the doorway of the ICU room, watching her with an expression that's gone absolutely still. His gaze moves from her face to her hands to the tactical vest to the dog tag and back to her face. There's something happening behind his eyes. A calculation. A recognition. The kind of recognition that makes the back of her neck feel exposed. Brooke doesn't meet his gaze. She checks the ventilator settings. She confirms the oxygen saturation. She does the work. And from the corner of her awareness, she watches him step back into the hallway and pull his phone from his coat pocket. The call is brief. Quiet. His voice takes on a tone she's never heard before. Professional, yes, but underneath it, something else. Something like interest. The kind of interest that precedes trouble. Yes, hello, this is Dr. James Ashford from Oak Creek Memorial. I need to inquire about the employment history of one of our nursing staff. Brooke Sullivan. Right. She worked nights in the ICU. I'm just confirming that her background check was thorough. Yes, I understand these are confidential matters. It's only that her behavior with a certain patient seems unusual. Very practiced, if you understand. Almost as if she had prior training in tactical assessment. Right. Exactly. I'll call you back. He hangs up. He doesn't look back at the ICU. He doesn't need to. Because in the observation window of room 3, Brooke Sullivan is checking the mechanical ventilation one more time, and her jaw is clenched so tight you could bounce a bullet off it. By the time Brooke clocked in for her next shift, the reassignment papers were already waiting on her locker, a single sheet in a manila folder marked Personnel Action, dated the previous morning. Psychiatric Wing. Effective immediately. Dr. Ashford's signature at the bottom in blue ink, precise as a surgical cut. She read it twice, standing in the break room while the coffee maker hissed behind her. The reason cited, patient care optimization and appropriate resource allocation. Translation, banishment. The psychiatric ward was 2 floors down, a different universe, trauma and addiction and the slow dissolution of minds, not the acute crisis management where she'd spent 3 years becoming invisible through competence. Brooke folded the paper without expression. Her hands didn't shake. Didn't even hesitate. She'd survived worse reassignments. She'd survived Marja, where orders came through static and half the unit didn't make it back. She'd survived telling herself for a decade that Major Brooke Sullivan was dead, buried under rubble and lies and classified operations that the Pentagon preferred never existed. A psychiatric ward reassignment from a man who didn't know her middle name was nothing. But it was systematic. That was the part that registered as she changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room. This wasn't a single act of retaliation. This was the opening move in a calculated campaign. Ashford hadn't just been making calls. He'd been planning. Building a case. Creating distance. She should have been reassigned and forgotten by Wednesday. Instead, on Thursday morning, the schedule hit the unit board and it made her breath catch, something she'd trained herself never to do. Double shifts. For consecutive nights, 10 to 10, with the midnight stretch hitting that dead zone between 3 and 6 when the hospital became a skeleton crew and exhaustion made you vulnerable. A normal nurse might have protested. Might have cited labor laws, union protections, the fact that her psychiatric ward assignment shouldn't have triggered a sudden rotation into overnight hell. Brooke said nothing. She arrived at 11:55 p.m. on Thursday, still in the clothes she'd worn during the day, her hair pulled back in a braid so tight it pulled the skin at her temples. The charge nurse, Patricia, gave her a look of pure apology as she handed over the census. I didn't schedule these. Ashford did it through the system. I tried to. It's fine, Brooke said. And she meant it. Double shifts were endurance, not crisis. She knew how to endure. She knew how to run on fumes and muscle memory and the kind of mental discipline that came from 17 years of military service, from holding a position in Helmand province for 14 hours after everyone else was killed, from learning that the body will continue functioning long after the mind has decided to break. What the double shifts accomplished, though, was isolation. By Friday, she'd been awake for 36 of the previous 48 hours. By Saturday, that number climbed to 50. She caught glimpses of the ICU staff in passing, nurses she'd befriended over 3 years, who suddenly had urgent tasks on different floors whenever she approached. Michelle, who'd been her coffee partner on the rare break, now took her lunch in the pharmacy. Derek, who'd saved her a seat in the break room during the oncology seminar last month, began clocking out 10 minutes early. The message was clear. Ashford was drawing lines. She noticed her access codes changing on Monday. Tuesday, she discovered her locker had been moved from the second-floor break room to a smaller room in the basement, where the storage closets lived. A handwritten note on a post-it, psychiatric staff utilizes basement facilities per new protocol. Ashford's handwriting. She'd seen it on the reassignment papers. The loops were the same, controlled, precise, the penmanship of someone who believed in order, in hierarchy, in the natural submission of those below him. By Wednesday, something worse happened. The SEAL's family came back, She learned this secondhand through a floor nurse who mentioned it in passing, words chosen carefully, eyes avoiding hers. His wife. The family had flown in from San Diego. They wanted an update on his condition. Wanted to meet the medical team. Brooke was 3 hours into a 12-hour shift in the psychiatric ward when the intercom requested her. Not requested. Called her name like a page, casual, urgent. Sullivan to ICU. Sullivan to ICU. She should have known not to answer. Should have let it cycle. But the instinct was older than her civilian disguise, older than the 3 years she'd spent pushing a medical cart and keeping her mouth shut. Instinct said someone was asking for her, and maybe it was something about the seal. Something medical. Something she could fix. The ICU smelled like it always did at that hour of the afternoon, antiseptic and coffee and the metal tang of 4 stands. The seal's room was third on the left, and through the glass she could see his wife standing beside the bed, her hand on his shoulder, and Ashford in his white coat, speaking with the kind of assured authority that comes from never being questioned. Mrs. Hendricks, Ashford was saying, your husband's vitals are stable. The transfusion was successful, though the initial response was somewhat chaotic. Nursing staff in the trauma bay don't always understand the nuances of field complications. Brooke stopped at the doorway. The wife looked up, a woman in her 50s, dark hair graying at the temples, the kind of controlled posture that came from military family, from being someone's support system through deployment after deployment. She recognized something in Brooke's face. Not her specifically, but the look of someone who understood crisis, who'd lived in waiting rooms and ICUs the way other people lived in their homes. Nurse Sullivan, Mrs. Hendricks said, I wanted to thank you personally. For the blood donation. We were told you had the rare type. That it made all the difference. Ashford's jaw tightened. Brooke could see the muscle flex under his chin like a reptile swallowing something it shouldn't have eaten. Actually, Ashford said, his voice dropping into that register she'd learned to recognize, the one he used when setting dominoes, I should clarify the situation for the family. Nurse Sullivan's donation was appropriate, certainly, but the subsequent care has been somewhat questionable. He turned to Brooke with the expression of a man explaining something to a child. In fact, I need to address a specific incident from earlier this week. The hospital protocol for medication administration includes the chain of command for a reason. When a nurse questions a doctor's clinical decision directly in front of family members, in front of a patient, it creates confusion and undermines patient confidence. Brooke had made the mistake on Monday. The seal was due for a 15 mg dose of lorazepam for anxiety, something reasonable, something within protocol, but his heart rate had been running elevated since the previous evening and benzodiazepines in that dosage on a patient with elevated tachycardia could drop his pressure further. She'd reviewed his chart that morning. She'd seen the trends. She'd learned in Fallujah, in San Gin Valley, in a dozen forward operating bases that clinical decisions kill people when they don't account for the whole picture. Doctor, she'd said quietly, during that morning rounds. Mrs. Hendricks' younger brother had been visiting, standing beside the bed. Lorazepam at 15 mg might complicate his blood pressure. His rate's already elevated. Is there indication we're missing? Not challenging. Not hostile. A question. The kind of question that competent nurses ask all the time, the kind that's supposed to be part of the system of checks that keeps patients from becoming numbers in adverse event reports. Ashford had stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. Your blood work, he said now, his voice like a tank idling in a very quiet garage, doesn't give you prescribing authority. Perhaps you should stick to bedpans and leave clinical decisions to actual physicians. The room went exactly the way it always does when someone says something cruel enough to alter the air pressure. Mrs. Hendricks' hand froze on her husband's shoulder. The husband himself, a man who'd been conscious for 2 days, getting stronger, turned his head toward the sound of Ashford's voice with the expression of someone who'd just learned a valuable truth about where he was. Brooke took one measured breath. In her peripheral vision, she could see her reflection in the glass door, the line of her shoulders, the set of her jaw, the hands at her sides that had held lives together, that had tourniquet limbs, that had felt for pulses in necks where there weren't supposed to be pulses anymore. She felt something hot move through her chest, but it stayed there. It didn't reach her face. It didn't make her voice break. A single tear traced her cheek. Not from pain. Not from humiliation. Just the physical response of someone who'd been awake for 34 hours with her body running on epinephrine and rage, everything pushed down so hard it was leaking out her eyes. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Ashford. "I've survived worse than you, doctor," she said. Then she turned and walked out. Didn't run. Didn't slam the door. Just left with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst things humans can do to each other, and realizing that a man in a white coat was just a man. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened in the break room on Thursday, the day after the medication incident had rippled through the hospital like contaminated blood through a transfusion line. She'd come in at 6 in the evening, early for her double shift, just needing to sit somewhere quiet, and she'd made herself a thermos of coffee, black, no sugar, the way she'd learned to drink it in field hospitals where you didn't waste calories on flavor. The break room was empty when she entered. Industrial fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A window looked out onto the parking lot where Houston heat was already shimmering off asphalt even at 6 in the evening. She sat in the corner chair, the one that let her see the door, and she drank her coffee. Michelle came in first. Grabbed her salad from the refrigerator without looking toward the corner. Then Derek. Then Sarah from surgical. Then James. One by one, they gathered their food with the timing of choreography, made brief comments to each other about their shifts, and left. The last one was Emma, a newer nurse, maybe 25, who'd worked alongside Brooke twice in the psychiatric ward. Emma paused at the door. Turned back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then she left too. Brooke sat there and finished her coffee. Her hands were completely steady around the thermos. She didn't think about being invisible. Didn't think about the work she'd done to become background, to disappear into the role of a competent nurse with no past and no future. Didn't think about how Ashford had seen something in her when the seal arrived, something that the dog tags and the tactical gear had triggered, and decided she was worth destroying. She thought about Marcus in the cemetery. About the 14 hours in Marja. About 17 men whose lives had depended on her staying calm, staying focused, staying exactly as invisible and dangerous as she'd been trained to be. Friday morning, a new notice appeared on the unit board. Not on the secure administrative line, but on the public bulletin where everyone clocked in and out. A formal disciplinary action. The form was yellow, like a warning, like a flag. Written disciplinary notice. Employee, Sullivan, Brooke. Date, yesterday. Charge, insubordination and boundary violations. Specific incident, questioning physician clinical decisions in patient presence, inappropriate communication with family members, creating confusion regarding standard treatment protocols. Recommendation, suspension pending investigation. Signature, Dr. Marcus Ashford, MD, Chief of Internal Medicine. Her name was highlighted in red. A highlighter. Like she was something to be noticed, to be marked, to be separated from the rest of the text. She read it twice. Didn't touch it. Just stood there in her scrubs, having just come off a 12-hour shift where she'd medicated patients, held hands, sat with people in the psychiatric ward who were drowning in their own minds, and she read it. Ashford appeared across the hallway. She knew he would. He timed it. He was standing at the nurse's station, and when she looked up, he smiled. The expression of a man who believed he'd just taken a significant piece off the board. "You'll regret making this personal," she said. Her voice was flat. The voice of someone reporting a fact, the way you'd report that the 4 line had infiltrated or the monitor was reading high. He laughed. A real laugh, not the calculated kind. The kind that came from genuine amusement. "Is that a threat, Nurse Sullivan?" From someone with no past and apparently no future here. She didn't respond. She just looked at him for a moment longer, and then she went back downstairs to the basement locker room, to the small space where her things had been moved without her permission, and she changed back into her street clothes. The door to the locker room hissed open and closed. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, Houston's afternoon was beginning to cool slightly, just the first whisper of evening coming in through a window that faced the parking lot, where her car sat waiting for her to drive home to her son and the life Ashford didn't know she was going to choose to reclaim. By Monday, the paperwork appeared on the unit board like an execution notice: Brooke Sullivan, psychiatric reassignment effective immediately. Ashford had been surgical about it. Not a verbal order. Not a conversation. Just a printed memo with his signature and 3 words that made every nurse on the ICU floor understand the message without him having to say it again. Inappropriate attachment to patient. The phrase hung in the air like antiseptic fumes, clinical and damning and impossible to refute because it didn't actually mean anything. It meant whatever Ashford needed it to mean. It meant she was done. By Tuesday, he'd filed the formal restriction, her badge access to the ICU permanently revoked, her name removed from the rotation board for that floor, her shift pattern reassigned to the psychiatric wing 3 floors down where the fluorescent lights were older and the patient acuity was lower, and nobody asked difficult questions about medication protocols or clinical judgment. She'd been boxed out completely. Professionally executed with bureaucratic precision. The other nurses whispered about it during shift change, their eyes darting away when she walked past the break room, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. She understood. They had mortgages. They had families. Ashford had already demonstrated what happened to people who asked questions or stood too close to his targets. The psychiatric ward had its own rhythm, its own smell, a mix of floor cleaner and something chemical, and underneath it all the faint copper of human exhaustion. The patients here were different. Quieter in a way that suggested their wars were all internal. Brooke moved through the 12-hour shifts with the same efficiency she'd shown in the ICU, but the work felt hollow. Checking vitals on people who barely registered her presence. Distributing medications from a cart that smelled like stale plastic. Listening to the distant beep of monitors that weren't measuring anything critical. By Wednesday, she realized Ashford hadn't just reassigned her. He'd buried her. The psychiatric ward was where nurses went to fade out. 3 floors below the action, far enough away that nobody could claim she was hovering near the SEAL's room, far enough away that her absence from the ICU would become normal. Routine. Forgotten. By Thursday, she'd learned that the SEAL, his name was Lieutenant Hayes, 26 years old, from San Diego, had stabilized. His vitals were holding. The bleeding had slowed. He was waking up in short bursts, his eyes tracking the ceiling, his chest moving in the careful rhythm of someone learning to breathe without pain. She knew this because she still had access to the hospital's shared patient database, and she checked it during her break in the psychiatric ward's break room where nobody ever sat, where the coffee was always cold, where the silence was the kind that made fluorescent lights seem loud. Saturday came. Ashford had the master schedule. Ashford could see the staffing matrix, the shift rotations, the way the ICU was technically supposed to run with a full complement of nurses, 3 on days, 3 on nights, 1 charge nurse coordinating everything. But Ashford also knew how to read between those lines, how to request that the charge nurse cover 2 critical rooms instead of coordinating, how to schedule the most experienced trauma nurse on vacation, how to ensure that Rodriguez, who was solid but not exceptional, was the only RN scheduled for the night shift alongside a single LPN and a resident named Chen who had been at Oak Creek for exactly 4 weeks. On paper, it was barely adequate. In reality, it was a controlled burn waiting for the right moment to ignite. Brooke was in the psychiatric ward at 10:56 p.m. when she heard it. Not directly. Not from the ICU. But the way sound traveled through the hospital's ventilation system, the way urgent voices carried through the empty corridors at night, the way she'd learned to read the hospital the way soldiers learn to read terrain. The tone of the overhead system shifted. Not a code blue yet. Just a change in pressure. A subtle difference in how the nurses were moving somewhere distant and above her. She checked Hayes' chart one more time from her borrowed computer terminal in psych. His last set of vitals from 10:15 p.m. showed subtle deterioration. Heart rate climbing. Respiratory rate up from 18 to 24. Blood oxygen holding, but the trend line was falling like a graph you could watch the decline on if you knew how to look. O2 sat 96%. Still acceptable. But falling. The kind of fall that didn't alarm anyone on its own, but when you'd spent 3 tours in field hospitals watching trauma casualties deteriorate, when you'd learned that the gap between stable and critical could be measured in minutes rather than hours, the signs were unmistakable. Something was wrong. Something was collapsing inside his chest. At 11:03 p.m., the alarms came. Not the gentle escalating beeps of a monitoring alert. The full-throated electronic scream of multiple systems failing simultaneously. Code blue, trauma ICU. Code blue, trauma ICU. The overhead system repeated it twice. Then again. The psychiatric ward had no ICU patients. The psychiatric ward had sedated patients who slept through the night, who didn't crash, who didn't arrest. The entire floor went quiet in a way that felt like collective held breath. And Brooke was already moving. She didn't make the decision consciously. Her body made it. Hands reaching for the trauma shears she'd kept in her pocket for 3 years, the muscle memory of 100 critical situations overriding every rational objection her civilian overlay could produce. She was running. The stairwell was empty. The hospital's night shift had all eyes on the trauma ICU above. She climbed 2 flights in the kind of silence that comes from moving with intent, from understanding that noise was a luxury, from knowing that she was about to do something that would end everything. The ICU corridor was chaos in the organized way that medical crises unfold. Rodriguez was running the code. The LPN was bagging, squeezing the ambu bag with mechanical rhythm. Chen stood at the crash cart looking like someone had asked him to solve quantum physics in a language he didn't speak. The monitors were screaming. Heart rate 140. Blood pressure 68/41. O2 sat 74 and dropping. The SEAL's chest wasn't rising and falling anymore. It was caved in, his right side collapsed like a building with the supports removed, his body trying desperately to breathe against the weight of a pneumothorax expanding inside his cavity, crushing his lung, compressing his heart, his oxygen levels falling because there was no room left for air to exist. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of emergency that killed people in field hospitals, that ended soldiers in minutes if nobody knew what to do, that required the kind of immediate action that didn't wait for chain of command or proper authorization or protocol committees. Brooke's badge didn't work. The ICU doors had sensor locks, and she hit the glass beside them hard enough that the sound carried down the corridor. Rodriguez looked up from the monitor, recognition and horror crossing her face simultaneously. She hit the unlock button without being asked. Security would be called. Ashford would be called. None of that mattered in the next 90 seconds. Brooke moved past the threshold into the room and her civilian mask didn't just slip. It shattered. She was reaching for the SEAL's personal equipment before anyone could speak, hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd done it under fire, who'd done it when every second meant the difference between a soldier coming home and a folded flag. The MRE package was still on the shelf where they kept personal items. Military issue. Meal ready to eat. She tore the corner open. The plastic crinkled, sharp and clinical and loud in the chaos of the code. The trauma shears came from her pocket. She didn't have to think about the measurements. Her hands knew. 2 inches by 3 inches. A square cut with the precision of someone who'd practiced this exact procedure 100 times in 100 training scenarios, on mannequins that didn't bleed, in trauma rooms that didn't have the smell of panic and sweat and blood underneath the antiseptic coating. Surgical tape. Chen had it. She made eye contact and said one word. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command spoken in a register her voice had never used in the psychiatric ward, in a tone that made Chen move without questioning, without hesitating, without understanding that he was taking orders from someone who'd been thoroughly erased from the hospital's official hierarchy. She pressed the plastic square against the wound site where the needle would go. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Anatomy that lived in her bones. The decompression needle was 14 gauge, long enough to reach the pleural cavity, short enough that she didn't need instruments to guide it. She'd found one in the emergency cart without asking. Her hand was steady. Not the steadiness of someone afraid. The steadiness of someone who'd already survived worse, who knew that trembling was a luxury of people who had something left to lose. The needle went in at an angle. The hiss came immediately. Air escaping. Pressure equalizing. The pneumothorax decompressing from the tension that was killing him. O2 sat 74. 78, 81. The rhythm returned to the monitor. Not normal. Not safe. But salvageable. 84. 87. 90. The SEAL's chest began rising again. His lungs remembered how to inflate. His heart remembered how to beat in something approaching normal rhythm. 92. Stable. Sinus rhythm returned. The alarms changed from screams to warning beeps. From certain death to crisis contained. 60 seconds had passed since she'd entered the room. Rodriguez was staring at her. Chen's hands were shaking. The monitor showed a heart rate falling from 140 to 102 to 89. Blood pressure climbing back to viable numbers. The SEAL's eyes flickered. Still alive. Still here. The door opened behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She could feel him the way you can feel the moment a room's temperature changes, the way you can read the shift in air pressure that means someone dangerous has arrived with intent. Ashford's face was white. His hands were clenched. And in that moment, Brooke understood that she'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade, that she'd revealed something in 90 seconds of competence that 3 months of invisibility couldn't hide, that the mask didn't just slip anymore. The mask was broken. He stared at her standing there in her scrubs with the trauma shears still in her hand, her eyes flat and calm and containing depths he'd been too blind to see. "Get her out of this hospital," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Now. Security is downstairs. Out. And document every unauthorized procedure she just performed. Compromised patient safety. Full incident report." He looked at Brooke like he was seeing her for the first time and finding something in that vision that made his hand shake. "You're fired. Terminated. Effective immediately. I'm requesting a full background investigation into your employment history, your qualifications, every breath you've taken since you started here." She looked back at him with the composure of someone who'd already died once and come back as something harder to kill. The room was so quiet you could hear the monitor beeping, could hear the ventilator hissing, could hear the sound of her own breathing, calm and measured and completely, utterly present. "I'm going on break," she said quietly. The crash alarm screamed from the ICU 3 floors above, the kind of sound that cuts through bone, code blue, trauma protocol, the electrical pulse of a dying patient translated into speaker systems designed to pierce human ears. Brooke heard it from the psychiatric wing where Ashford had exiled her, heard it in the moment she was reviewing discharge paperwork for a woman who'd attempted suicide 72 hours prior. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look up from the chart. She simply stood, set down her pen with the precision of someone who'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury, and moved toward the stairwell like a woman walking into rooms she'd memorized. The psychiatric ward doors closed behind her with a hydraulic hiss. Brooke took the stairs 3 at a time, her legs carrying her with the muscle memory of someone who'd climbed far worse than concrete steps, who'd climbed through smoke and darkness and the sound of rounds hitting metal. Nurses scattered as she pushed through the ICU doors. The monitor was flat-lined. The ventilator was wheeling. The on-call resident stood frozen at the bedside with his hands at his sides, staring at the cardiac strip as if the problem was somewhere in the numbers rather than in the room, in the moment, in the absolute and immediate need for someone to move. The SEAL was grey. Lips the color of old concrete. Pupils blown. His chest wasn't rising, wasn't falling, the ribs on his left side were collapsing inward with each failed breath cycle, the lung compressed into the space where air should have been, a tension pneumothorax that had wrapped its hand around his heart and was squeezing. Brooke didn't announce herself. Didn't wait for permission. She moved to the supply cart and found what she needed in 90 seconds, the kind of speed that comes from having done this before, having done this in conditions that would have made any civilian nurse vomit. Her hands moved on their own. She grabbed an MRE package from the SEAL's personal effects stacked in the corner, beef ravioli, the smell of it metallic and wrong, and tore the plastic with her teeth, her movements sharp and automatic as muscle memory took over. The plastic came free in one piece. She shaped it into a square with surgical precision, her scarred hands working like they had a direct line to something beyond conscious thought. Tape. She wrapped it 3 times around his chest, sealing the plastic square over a point on the second intercostal space just below his collarbone. The motion was practiced. The angle was perfect. A valve fashioned from desperation and training, a one-way seal that would let air escape the pleural space but not return. Combat medicine from a conflict that wasn't supposed to exist, applied in a Houston hospital at 11:22 p.m. on a Saturday night. The hiss came first. Air escaping under pressure, the sound of a lung expanding, the sound of life returning in a single exhalation. Brooke's hands found the needle. 14 gauge. Angled precisely. She decompressed the chest at the landmark she'd marked with her fingertip, feeling the pop as the needle penetrated the parietal pleura, and the pressure released like a held breath finally allowed to exhale. The monitor's rhythm shifted. 1 beat. 2 beats. The flat line became a rhythm again, broken but present, a sinus rhythm that climbed from the floor of disaster toward the ceiling of recovery. Oxygen climbed. 68, 74. 82, 89. The SEAL's color returned by degrees, the blue receding from his lips, the gray lifting from his skin, his pupils shrinking back to human size. The room had gone dead silent except for the monitor's steady beeping, the ventilator's mechanical breath, the sound of her own respiration, calm and measured and completely, utterly present. 45 seconds. That's all it had taken. The difference between breathing and not breathing, between a family notified and a family spared. The on-call resident stared at her with something that might have been gratitude or might have been the simple shock of watching someone else think faster than he could process. Then Ashford appeared in the doorway. His face changed as he took in the scene, the SEAL breathing, the monitor steady, the plastic square taped to his chest in a configuration that violated every protocol in the hospital's manual. His eyes found Brooke and held there like a man watching his strategy dissolve. She met his gaze without flinching, without apology, without the smallest crack in her composure. A muscle worked in his jaw. His hand moved to his phone with the precision of a man accessing a weapon. "Security," he said. His voice was steady but his eyes were already calculating, already shifting to damage control. "ICU now. Remove this nurse from the floor." The words came out soft, almost polite, but they landed like a verdict. 2 security officers appeared within minutes, not the hospital's regular staff but someone's definition of serious, men with radio clips and blank professional faces. Brooke was already moving toward the door. She didn't resist. Resistance would have been the mistake Ashford was waiting for, would have given him the footage, the narrative, the evidence he needed to twist this moment into proof of her instability rather than her competence. She simply walked with the officers, her hands visible, her face neutral as the hallway cameras caught every step. Ashford's voice followed her as she reached the elevator. "You performed unauthorized procedures. You compromised patient safety. You violated every protocol this hospital maintains." He was speaking to her but addressing the room, building his record, constructing the frame that would hold his version of events. "This is a serious breach of professional conduct. I'm recommending your immediate termination and a full background investigation into your employment history and credentials." The elevator doors closed on his face. Brooke watched the numbers climb, 4th floor, 5th floor, 6th floor, and something inside her that had been holding steady for 3 years began to fray at the edges. Not from fear. Not from doubt. From the crushing weight of having been right all along, that staying invisible was impossible, that one moment of choosing to save a life would unravel the fiction she'd constructed brick by brick for 8 years. By midnight, she'd been terminated. The paperwork was expedited, Ashford pushing it through with the efficiency of a man who'd already called his contacts and made his case. Her badge was deactivated. Her name was flagged in the system. The hospital's legal team was already drafting language about her violation of scope of practice, about the liability exposure from an unlicensed performance of clinical procedures. Ashford had transformed a crisis save into a career ending. She sat in her car for 2 hours before she drove to George Bush Memorial Cemetery. The rain had started at 9 p.m., the kind of Houston rain that came sideways, that hammered the windshield like fists. She parked and walked, her shoes soaking through, the cemetery empty at 2:17 a.m. except for the stones and the sky and the weight of 8 years pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. The headstone was simple. Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan. Dates. A soldier's epitaph that said nothing about the man, nothing about the morning she'd received the notification, nothing about the classified operation in Marja that had erased her husband and then, systematically, erased her. She stood in the rain and felt the water run down her face and didn't wipe it away. "I tried," she said. Her voice sounded strange in the rain, small and old. "I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. I tried to be nobody. Just a nurse. No one important. No one dangerous." The rain drummed against her shoulders. "But I couldn't let another one die. I couldn't stand there while someone bled out when I could stop it. And now it's all come apart. Everything they told me would stay buried, it's surfacing. They can erase records, but they can't erase who I am. They can erase my name from the system, but they can't erase what I've seen. What I know." She looked at the dates on the stone, Marcus's dates, the span of his life reduced to numbers. "I failed you," she whispered. "I failed the promise I made to disappear. I was supposed to vanish into civilian life and never surface. They were supposed to erase Major Brooke Sullivan and leave nothing but a nurse named Brooke who no one asked questions about. But I'm still here." And he saw it. And now the whole thing is coming down. She stood there until the rain began to ease, until the sky started to shift from black toward that particular shade of gray that comes before dawn. Major Brooke Sullivan had been classified as a witness to a war crime in Marja in 2010. She'd seen something that couldn't exist within official military records, something that had resulted in 4 senior officers' convictions when the classified tribunal concluded. She'd testified under protection. She'd been the only person willing to name it. And the military, in exchange for her silence afterward, had erased her. Literally erased her. New social security number. New background constructed from whole cloth. New identity as a civilian nurse with no military connection, no combat training, no reason for her hands to move with the precision of someone who'd spent 14 hours providing emergency surgery in a defensive position with rounds hitting the sandbags above her head. Dr. Ashford didn't know what he'd found when he'd examined her hands. He'd seen competence and mistaken it for ambition. He'd seen composure and mistaken it for insubordination. He demanded a background investigation because he believed he was uncovering a fraudulent hire. He had no idea what was actually buried in the classified files, no concept of the weight he'd just set in motion by pushing her name into official channels. Those channels had their own protocols. Their own oversight. Their own people who'd been waiting 8 years for her to surface. The rain stopped. Brooke stood at Marcus's grave in the silence of the cemetery and waited for the consequences to arrive. Monday morning arrived like a verdict. Brooke stood at her locker in the staff wing of Oak Creek Memorial, security flanking her like pallbearers, watching as she emptied 16 years of accumulated quiet into a cardboard box. Her hands moved with the same precision that had held lives together, steady, methodical, refusing to telegraph emotion. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical complaint. A stethoscope. 2 pairs of compression socks. A faded photo of Marcus in dress blues, taken 23 years ago when he was still alive and she still believed promises could survive combat zones. She'd kept the hospital badge clipped to her scrubs even though it no longer worked. Old habits from people who'd learned that invisible was safer than seen. The other nurses had stopped coming to this wing hours ago. They'd learned from Ashford's example, Proximity to Brooke Sullivan could become contagious, something to avoid like a contaminated sharps container. She didn't blame them. Survival meant knowing which way the institutional wind was blowing, and Ashford had made the direction unmistakably clear. His documentation was meticulous. His accusations were typed in hospital letterhead. His authority was absolute. By the time she'd been escorted from the ICU on Saturday night, she was already becoming a ghost, a narrative that existed in files and forwarded emails but not in actual presence. Not in conversation. Not in the break room where nurses gathered their lunches anymore. Security watched her seal the box. Nobody spoke. The silence had weight to it, the kind of silence that comes before something irreversible happens. Brooke had heard it before in desert compounds and military tents, the breath-holding quiet before orders arrive that change everything. She didn't ask how long she had to clear her locker. She didn't ask if there was paperwork to sign. She'd been fired by people with actual authority before, the kind who didn't need to explain themselves. Ashford had been practice. The real thing always came later, from people who held real power. That was when the hospital's front entrance doors swung open with force enough to rattle the glass. Jackson. Her son. 16 years old, carrying a wooden shadow box the way soldiers carry rifles at funerals. His face was flushed, his jaw set with the same determined angle as his father's, as hers, as the men and women who'd learned that some things were worth doing even when the cost was visible to everyone. He moved through the corridor with a kind of focused intensity that made people step aside without understanding why. His voice cracked when he found her, but it was the crack of strain, not fear. "Mom, they need to see these." His hands gripped the shadow box like it was the only thing anchoring him to the floor. "You can't let him win." Brooke felt something shift in her chest, not trembling, never that, but a recalibration. The kind of moment where a mother's mission conflicts with a soldier's training. Both required her presence. Both demanded composure. "Jackson, this isn't." "It is." He opened the shadow box before she could finish, and the gathered staff, security, a nurse or two who'd lingered, a respiratory therapist pretending to check supply orders, stopped moving. The shadow box contained military decorations. A bronze star with ribbon the color of blood and sand. A purple heart. 2 more purple hearts beneath it. And at the bottom, embedded in the velvet backing of the frame like a relic, a navy cross, its ribbon striped in red and blue and white. The hospital corridor, which had been a corridor, which had held the ordinary sounds of beeping monitors and squeaking carts and the soft rasp of rubber-soled shoes on wax tile, became something else. It became a gallery. It became a courtroom. It became a moment where invisible things suddenly demanded to be seen. A Navy nurse emerged from the ICU, the one who'd arrived with the SEAL on Saturday, who'd coordinated his transport, who had the bearing of someone used to making split-second decisions about life. She stepped forward, and her voice shook as she read the placard beneath the medals. Major Brooke Sullivan. Not a question. A recognition. The kind of recognition that meant somebody had checked files, made calls, verified information that was supposed to be sealed. The room's pressure changed. The air itself seemed to acknowledge something it had been ordered not to see. Behind Jackson, a man in dress blues emerged, not young, weathered in the way that comes from decades of decisions that involve life and death. The SEAL's commanding officer. Master Chief Marcus Grayson, his name tape read, though his eyes held the authority of someone who'd operated at levels where rank was almost decorative. He moved with the kind of measured precision that came from being comfortable in spaces where any sudden motion could be misinterpreted as threat. He took the file from the Navy nurse's hands. His jaw was the kind that could cut glass, and when he spoke, his voice came low and even, the voice of a man who'd given orders to men holding high-explosive devices. Bronze star with Valor. He paused, letting that settle. Purple heart. Jackson's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of truth finally allowed to exist in daylight. Security hadn't moved. They were just watching now, understanding on some level that this had escalated past their authority. Second purple heart, Grayson continued. Third. The medals clicked against the frame as he gestured. And a Navy Cross. For actions in Marja, where she held a position for 14 hours after her team was killed, saving 17 SEALs including, he paused here, his eyes shifting toward the ICU behind them. Including the father of the man she just saved. 4-star General James Hendricks. The word should have caused noise, shock, exclamation, the sound of cognitive disruption. Instead, the silence deepened. It became a thing with texture and weight, like the silence in a church after a profound prayer or in a courtroom after a guilty verdict. Brooke stood motionless. She didn't look at Jackson. She didn't look at the medals that represented 14 hours of holding ground while her team died around her, while she made the decision to save strangers instead of retrieve her husband's body. Some things were meant to stay in shadow. Some things were too heavy to carry in daylight. But Jackson had brought them anyway, and now they hung in the hospital's fluorescent glare like an accusation against the narrative Ashford had constructed. The FBI liaison arrived 3 minutes later. He wore a suit that cost more than anything Ashford had ever purchased and carried a tablet with the kind of casual authority that came from federal agencies and offices without windows. He positioned himself between Brooke and the security guards, which was its own kind of statement. Dr. Ashford. Not a question. The liaison didn't look at him. Ashford was elsewhere, having fled the moment the Navy nurse began reading names, but everyone understood that the words were broadcast. Your inquiry into Major Sullivan triggered a comprehensive review of ICU records over the past 18 months. We found a pattern. The hospital CEO stepped forward, a woman named Morrison who'd been avoiding Brooke's eye since the firing, and opened a file thick enough to contain every mistake, every falsified chart, every death attributed to nurses who'd actually done nothing wrong except exist in proximity to a surgeon who couldn't admit his own incompetence. 3 patient deaths, Doctor. Morrison's voice was steady, which meant she'd prepared for this moment, which meant someone had called her before the Navy showed up. 3 families told their loved ones died due to nursing errors. We have the original records now. Before you altered them. The liaison added, altering federal medical records is a felony. 3 felonies. Additionally, we found evidence of obstruction, specifically, attempts to discredit a protected witness through systematic institutional harassment. Protected witness. The words floated into the corridor like a verdict that had already been decided, like the background investigation Ashford had demanded had actually investigated him instead. Security moved then, not to arrest Brooke but to escort someone else. Ashford, who'd returned when his absence became impossible, backed through the crowd with his hands up, his earlier precision and competence crumbling into desperate excuses that nobody was listening to anymore. You don't understand, those patients were already compromised, the nurses didn't follow protocols, I was protecting the hospital's reputation. 2 Houston police officers entered. They didn't look at him with contempt or anger, they looked at him the way you look at something that's broken and needs to be taken away. His wrists were thin, Brooke noticed. Soft. The wrists of someone who'd never held a weapon, never made the kind of decisions that required hands that could do violence if necessary. As they led him out through the same doors where he'd had Brooke escorted, he locked eyes with her one final time. She stood perfectly still, that quiet dignity unshaken, and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. The angle of her shoulders said everything. The straightness of her spine said everything. The fact that she was still standing and he was leaving in handcuffs said everything. The FBI agent's voice followed him into the parking lot. The Department of Justice will be reviewing 3 wrongful death cases for potential criminal charges. The door slid closed behind him. The hospital resumed its ordinary sounds, the ventilator in room for 21 cycling, someone's pager chirping, the distant voice of a doctor requesting labs. But the corridor had changed. The light seemed different. The air pressure seemed different. Things that had been invisible had become visible, and visibility meant that some stories couldn't be rewritten anymore. 6 months later, Brooke stood at a hospital window in her Navy Medical Corps uniform, the major's insignia pinned to her collar like a promise finally kept. The uniform fit her differently than civilian scrubs, it held her straighter, made her presence take up more space, acknowledged in its very fabric that some kinds of authority couldn't be disguised or erased. Behind her, in a private room, 4-star General James Hendricks rose from his hospital bed where he'd been receiving follow-up vascular surgery. He was older than the SEAL, which made sense. He was the father, the source, the man she'd saved a lifetime ago when she was still Major Sullivan and still carrying secrets that had weight enough to crush most people. His eyes held hers with the recognition of someone saluting someone else, not for rank but for sacrifice made quietly and without expectation of reward. He rendered a slow, deliberate salute. His movements were still stiff from the surgery, but they were precise and intentional, the kind of precision that came from having spent decades respecting people who'd chosen duty over comfort. She returned it. Her hands no longer trembled. Her back was straight. The trembling, when it came in those 6 months between segments, had been in private, in empty apartments, in the moments before sleep, in the parking lot of Arlington Cemetery when she'd finally sat at Marcus's grave and told him that she'd been released. Jackson watched from the doorway, tears streaming down his face but smiling the way only children can smile when they finally understand that their parent was never ordinary at all. Through the window, visible across the street in the parking lot of a strip mall, Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table beneath a faded insurance company banner, papers scattered as wind tugged at his cheap tie. A single customer walked past his table without stopping. The chair beside him was empty. The future extending in front of him was the kind of future that came after consequences finally arrived. "You saved my life in Marja," General Hendricks said, his voice rough but steady, the voice of someone who'd carried gratitude for 14 years without knowing where to deliver it. "You saved my son here. And you never asked for recognition." Brooke shook her head. "I was just doing my job, sir. Both times." He smiled. "That's what heroes say, Major." She looked out at the hospital floor below the window, at the nurses moving between rooms, at the quiet competence that keeps people alive in the dark hours when nobody's watching. Jackson joined her at the window, and she put her arm around him, his head coming just to her shoulder now, almost grown, almost ready to understand that some promises are kept not by staying silent but by breaking the silence when lives depend on it. "Your father would be proud," the general said. Brooke touched the dog tag now around her own neck, Marcus's tag, the one she'd recognized on that first night, the one that had started everything. "He taught me that some promises are worth breaking." The screen fades on her reflection in the window, navy uniform and nurse's heart, finally, after all these years, allowed to be both. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated or overlooked, hit subscribe and the notification bell. Comment below. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong? And share this with anyone who's ever had to be invisible to survive. Thank you for watching.